I never believed in things like this before March of 2001. I spent 22 years with the FBI, most of it in violent crimes and fugitive apprehension, and I thought I understood what danger looked like. I had tracked killers through mountain wilderness, conducted raids in neighborhoods where violence was just part of the landscape, and seen enough crime scenes to believe I knew the worst that could happen when humans ventured into isolated places. None of it prepared me for what happened in the forests northwest of Traverse City, and none of it explained why the Bureau worked so hard to bury the truth. My name is David Brennan, and I'm retired now, living with a diagnosis that makes the non-disclosure agreements in the career threats feel like problems for someone else's life. Someone needs to know what really happened out there, and someone needs to understand why 3 federal agents and 2 state troopers went into those woods and only 2 of us came back. The operation started as a routine training exercise, the kind of interagency coordination work that looks good in reports and helps different law enforcement branches learn to work together. Assistant Director Palmer had arranged it, a 3-day wilderness tracking course in the Manistee National Forest designed to improve our ability to pursue fugitives in remote terrain. 6 FBI agents and 6 Michigan State police officers, all experienced field personnel, all physically capable, all armed and trained in defensive tactics. It was supposed to be educational, a controlled environment where we could practice skills without the pressure of an actual manhunt. The weather forecast was clear, the area was familiar to the state police instructors, and nobody anticipated anything more dangerous than maybe a twisted ankle or some mild discomfort from sleeping in tents. We arrived on March 14th, meeting at a ranger station about 15 miles outside Traverse City, where the Forest Service had provided us with maps and access to trails that were closed to public use during the off-season. The air was cold and damp, that particular chill you get in northern Michigan in early spring when winter hasn't quite decided to let go, and patches of old snow still clung to the shaded areas beneath the pines. Our instructors were Sergeant Dale Mitchell and Corporal James Torres from the State Police Tactical Unit, both men in their 40s with the kind of weathered faces you get from spending more time outdoors than in. Mitchell had been running these wilderness trainings for over a decade, and Torres had grown up in the Upper Peninsula, hunting and fishing those forests since he was old enough to carry a rifle. They knew the terrain, knew the wildlife, and they had a calm, methodical way of teaching that put everyone at ease. The FBI contingent included myself, Special Agent Rachel Cordova, who worked forensics and evidence collection, Special Agent Marcus Webb from our hostage rescue team, Special Agent Jennifer Cole, who handled violent crimes out of the Detroit office, Special Agent Thomas Keller, who specialized in organized crime, and Special Agent Brian Hayes from our Chicago field office. We were all in our 30s and 40s, all fit enough to handle 3 days of hiking and camping, all comfortable with firearms and tactical operations. The state police brought Trooper Linda Morrison from their canine unit, Trooper Michael Santos, who worked search and rescue, Trooper David Chen from the tactical team, Trooper Amy Sullivan, who handled evidence recovery, and Trooper James Mitchell, no relation to the sergeant, who coordinated wilderness training programs across the state. 14 people total, professionals who knew their jobs, who had worked in dangerous situations before, who should have been more than capable of handling anything a Michigan forest could throw at them. Day 1 went exactly as planned. We hiked 8 miles into the forest, following game trails and logging roads until we reached a clearing near a stream where we established base camp. The area was beautiful in that stark early spring way, with hardwoods just beginning to show the first hints of buds and the forest floor still carpeted in last autumn's leaves. Mitchell and Torres taught us how to read tracks in different soil conditions, how to estimate the age of disturbances, how to predict a fugitive's direction based on terrain features and human psychology. We learned to move quietly through underbrush, to communicate with hand signals, to maintain tactical awareness in an environment where radio coverage was unreliable at best. The work was challenging but satisfying, the kind of practical training that felt immediately applicable to real-world situations. That evening we built fires, ate our field rations, and listened to Torres tell stories about some of the fugitives the state police had tracked through these same forests over the years. He had a dry sense of humor and a storyteller's gift for making tracking sound like a chess game played with footprints and broken branches. He mentioned the local legends at one point, almost casually, talking about the Michigan Dogman like it was just another piece of regional folklore. A creature from Native American stories and more recent sightings, a bipedal canine that stood 7 feet tall and appeared in the forests during certain years. We laughed, of course, because we were federal agents and state troopers, not people who put stock in campfire stories. But Torres didn't laugh with us. He just stared into the flames and said the local Odawa people had stories about these woods that went back centuries, stories about things that hunted in the darkness and protected territories from intruders. Mitchell told him to knock it off, said he was going to give the feds nightmares, and we all laughed again, but this time it felt a little forced, a little nervous. Then we turned in, sleeping in tents arranged in a rough circle around the fire, and I remember lying in my sleeping bag that first night, thinking how quiet the forest was, how isolated we were from anything resembling civilization, and how comfortable I felt despite that isolation. That feeling of safety wouldn't last past the next evening. Day 2 started with more intensive training. We split into teams for a tracking exercise, each group taking turns as evaders and pursuers, using the techniques Mitchell had taught us to either leave a trail or follow one. My team consisted of myself, Rachel Cordova, and troopers Chen and Sullivan. We spent 2 hours laying a complex trail through the forest, doubling back, using streams to hide our tracks, trying to employ every trick we had learned. The morning was cold but clear, our breath misting in the air as we moved through the undergrowth. Chen was particularly skilled, showing us how to step on rocks and exposed roots to avoid leaving prints, how to use natural features to break up our trail pattern. Sullivan had a gift for reading terrain, guiding us along routes that would be difficult to follow, keeping us moving efficiently through areas where the forest grew dense enough to obscure our passage. It was good work, the kind of challenge that kept us focused and engaged, and I remember thinking this was exactly the kind of training we needed, skills that would translate directly to tracking actual fugitives through wilderness environments. Around mid-morning, while we were crossing a small ravine, Chen stopped abruptly and raised a closed fist. We all froze instantly, falling into the tactical discipline that was second nature after years of field work. He crouched low, examining something in the leaf litter, and when I moved closer, I saw what had caught his attention. A deer carcass, maybe 3 days old, partially covered with forest debris. The kill itself was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The deer's neck was broken cleanly, the head twisted at an angle that looked impossible, and there were no bite marks, no signs of feeding, just that broken neck and scratch marks along the flanks that looked almost surgical in their precision. Chen photographed it with his department camera, making notes about the location, and Sullivan examined the surrounding area, finding more signs that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Disturbed earth, broken branches at about 7 feet high, and a smell that wasn't quite right, not the usual predator musk, but something sharper, more acrid. We marked the location on our maps and continued the exercise, but the mood had shifted. Something about that kill felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and I noticed Chen and Sullivan exchanging glances that suggested they felt it too. We returned to base camp around noon to find the other teams already there, comparing notes on their tracking exercises. Mitchell was setting up a tactical map, marking trails and discussing pursuit tactics, and Torres was organizing lunch supplies. Everything looked normal, routine, exactly what a training camp should look like. That normalcy made what we found next even more disturbing. The camp had been disturbed while we were gone. The food supplies we had stored in bear bags, hung from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, had been torn open. Not pulled down, but torn open while still hanging, the bags shredded with precision, and the contents scattered on the ground below in a pattern that suggested deliberate searching rather than frantic feeding. Mitchell was already examining the scene when we arrived, his face tight with concern that he was trying to hide behind professional assessment. Agent Keller and Trooper Morrison were photographing the damage, while Webb stood guard with his rifle ready, and Torres was walking the camp perimeter with his eyes on the ground, reading something in the disturbed earth that I couldn't yet interpret. The tracks were everywhere once you knew to look for them. Large canine prints, but wrong in subtle ways that became more obvious the longer you studied them. Mitchell crouched beside the clearest impression near our supply cache and pulled out a measuring tape, working in silence for several minutes, taking multiple measurements and photographing from different angles. When he finally stood up, his face had gone pale in a way that made my stomach drop. Torres called him over to the tree line, and I followed, curiosity overcoming the caution that was starting to build in my chest. What Torres had found made that caution turn into something closer to fear. A sequence of tracks leading from the forest to our camp and back, showing clear bipedal locomotion. The stride length was over 6 feet, the depth of the impression suggesting something very heavy moving on 2 legs, and the prints themselves were canine but too large, too elongated, with 5 distinct claw marks and a pad structure that didn't match any known animal. There was something else, too. Tree bark had been stripped at about 7 feet high on several trunks surrounding the camp, the wood beneath showing deep gouges in parallel lines. Whatever had made those marks had been strong enough to tear through living wood like it was paper, and it had done so at a height that suggested something tall, something that could reach well above human height without effort. Torres ran his fingers along one of the gouges, his jaw tight, and said something in Spanish that was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but Mitchell heard it and nodded grimly. Rachel approached with her evidence kit and took castings of the best prints, working quickly but professionally, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly despite her years of experience. She had seen the same things we had, understood that these tracks didn't match anything in her training or her knowledge of North American wildlife, and that understanding was written clearly on her face. Mitchell gathered us together and delivered his assessment in a voice that was calm but firm. Large predator. Species unknown, exhibiting unusual behavior including bipedal movement and apparent intelligence in how it had searched our supplies. Immediate evacuation was mandatory, no discussion, no debate. Agent Keller argued that we should at least document everything thoroughly, take more photographs, and collect more evidence before leaving. He was the analytical type, always wanting complete data before making decisions, and his instinct was to treat this like any other crime scene that needed proper processing. Mitchell shut him down immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whatever had made those tracks had been in our camp while we were gone, had gone through our supplies with apparent purpose, and had shown no fear of human presence or human scent. We were leaving now, staying together in tight formation, and we were getting back to the staging area as quickly as the terrain allowed. We packed in tense silence, every sound from the forest making us jump, making hands drift toward weapons. The normal background noise of the woods, birds calling and wind in the trees, seemed muted somehow, not the complete silence we would experience later, but diminished, wrong. Animals knew something was in these woods that shouldn't be there, and they were reacting accordingly, and we were starting to understand that we should be reacting the same way. Agent Cole found something while packing her tent that made the situation even worse. A tuft of dark fur snagged on a branch near where she had been sleeping, about 4 feet off the ground. The fur was coarse and thick, approximately 4 inches long, with a texture unlike anything I had felt before. Not bear, not wolf, not any domestic dog breed I knew. Rachel sealed it in an evidence bag without comment, adding it to the castings and photographs, but her expression told me she was thinking the same thing I was. Something had been standing right next to Cole's tent during the night, close enough to leave fur on a branch, close enough that it could have reached inside if it had wanted to. Mitchell announced we were cutting the training short and heading back to the trailhead immediately, keeping his voice calm and professional to prevent panic, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line. Torres had already unslung his rifle and was checking the magazine, and that simple action told me more about the seriousness of our situation than any briefing could have. We formed up quickly, establishing a tactical column with Mitchell on point and Torres bringing up the rear, the rest of us spaced evenly with overlapping fields of observation. Every fourth person was designated as security, responsible for maintaining situational awareness and watching for threats, and I ended up in a security position with my rifle ready and my eyes constantly moving across the forest around us. The hike started well enough, moving at a good pace, faster than the leisurely walk that had brought us in, but not so fast that we would exhaust ourselves before reaching safety. The trail was clear and well marked, the weather held fair, and under normal circumstances, we would have made the staging area by mid-afternoon. But circumstances were far from normal, and about an hour into the march, I noticed the bird calls had stopped entirely. Not gradually fading as we passed through their territory, but cutting off abruptly, like a switch had been thrown. The forest went silent except for our footsteps and breathing, and even the insects seemed to have disappeared. Morrison, who had been walking ahead of me, turned back with a questioning look. She had noticed it too, and in her 15 years with the canine unit, she had spent enough time in forests to know when something was wrong. Mitchell halted us with a raised fist, and we stopped instantly, everyone dropping into defensive crouches and scanning the surrounding forest with weapons up. The silence pressed against us, thick and unnatural, and I could hear my own heartbeat and the blood rushing in my ears. My mouth was dry despite the water I had been drinking, and my hands wanted to shake, but training kept them steady on my rifle. Torres moved up to consult with Mitchell, and they had a brief, intense conversation that involved a lot of pointing at the forest and checking their maps. When they turned back to us, Mitchell's face was grim in a way that made my stomach clench. He said we were changing course, cutting cross-country to reach a secondary trail that would get us to the staging area faster. It would be harder going, rougher terrain, but it would save time and avoid an area he no longer felt comfortable traversing. We moved out again, this time leaving the established trail and pushing through denser undergrowth. The going was slower and more exhausting, branches catching at our clothes and gear, roots threatening to trip the unwary, but we maintained formation and discipline, everyone keeping their assigned spacing and sectors of responsibility, professionals doing what we were trained to do even as fear sat like ice in all our chests. That was when the sound came, low at first, almost subsonic, a rumble that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Then it rose in pitch and volume, becoming a howl that held notes no wolf or dog ever made. It was rage and hunger and intelligence all wrapped together, echoing through the trees from somewhere to our right, maybe 200 yards away, maybe closer. The sound lasted perhaps 5 seconds and cut off abruptly, leaving us standing frozen in the silence that followed. Nobody moved and nobody spoke. We just stood there with our weapons raised and our hearts pounding, waiting for something else to happen, waiting for whatever had made that sound to reveal itself or attack, or do anything other than leave us standing in that oppressive quiet. When nothing did, Mitchell got us moving again, but faster now, abandoning any pretense of caution in favor of speed. We needed to put miles between us and whatever had made that sound, needed to reach the staging area and the vehicles in the relative safety of civilization. Agent Hayes was the first to actually see it, assigned to watch our left flank as we moved. Later, he told me he had felt eyes on him for several minutes before he spotted the source, something pacing us through the trees, moving parallel to our path and matching our speed exactly. It stayed in the shadows, using the terrain to remain mostly hidden, but occasionally visible in brief glimpses between the trunks. When he finally got a clear look, his training failed him completely. He stumbled and went down hard on one knee, his rifle clattering against rocks, and we all spun toward him with weapons tracking, expecting an attack. But Hayes was just staring into the forest with his face gone white and his breathing rapid and shallow. He tried to speak twice before words came out, telling us something was following us, walking upright, too tall, wrong shape. Mitchell didn't waste time on questions. He pulled Hayes to his feet, checked that he wasn't injured, and got us moving immediately, picking up the pace even more until we were almost jogging despite the rough terrain and heavy gear. For the next 30 minutes we saw nothing and heard nothing, but the sense of being watched never faded. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, my finger resting on the trigger guard of my rifle in a way that violated every safety protocol I had ever learned. Rachel, normally calm and collected under pressure, was jumpy too, and I could see the same tension in everyone's posture. We all knew something was out there in the darkness between the trees, something that was tracking us with purpose and intelligence, and the rational part of my mind that insisted there had to be a logical explanation was being drowned out by the primal part that understood we were prey. The attack came without warning, sudden and devastating in its violence. One moment we were pushing through dense undergrowth, maintaining our tactical formation and moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The next moment, something massive crashed through the brush from our right side, moving with explosive speed that seemed impossible for anything that size. I caught a glimpse of dark fur and impossible height before it slammed into Trooper Chen with the force of a car hitting a pedestrian. Chen was lifted completely off his feet, his rifle flying from his hands, and his body ragdolled through the air before hitting a tree trunk 10 feet away, with a sound that made my stomach turn, the wet crack of breaking bone echoing through the forest. He crumpled to the ground and didn't move, and I knew without checking that he was either dead or dying. Training took over and 12 weapons came up, 12 trained law enforcement officers engaging a threat the way we had been taught since the academy. We fired in a sustained burst that should have dropped a grizzly bear, the noise incredible and overlapping into a continuous roar that echoed through the trees. Muzzle flashes created a strobe effect that made everything seem unreal, and I saw my rounds hit center mass, watched the impacts tear into the creature's chest and shoulder. It staggered but kept moving, crossing the small clearing we were in with massive bounds that covered ground faster than anything that size should be able to move. The creature was 7 feet tall at least, covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the shadows, with muscles that seemed designed for tearing things apart. The head was a wolf's head, but enlarged and more intelligent, with amber eyes that caught the light and reflected it back, and those eyes held awareness and calculation and intelligence that no animal should possess. My rounds hit it. I'm certain of that. I watched the creature absorb punishment that would have killed any bear or wolf or any living thing I knew of. And then, while we were still firing, while brass was still raining down around our feet, it turned and crashed back into the forest, moving fast despite the wounds, moving with purpose and direction rather than blind panic. The creature was gone in seconds, vanishing into the dense undergrowth like it had never been there, and we stood in ringing silence with our ears damaged from the gunfire and smoke hanging in the still air. Nobody moved for several long seconds, just stood there with fingers still on triggers and eyes scanning for threats, trying to process what we had just seen and what we had just done. Torres broke the spell by shouting Chen's name and rushing to where the trooper lay crumpled against the tree, and Morrison followed immediately, her medical training taking over. I maintained security with half the group, while the other half converged on Chen, forming a protective circle around the downed officer, and my hands were shaking so badly I had trouble keeping my rifle steady. Morrison assessed Chen with quick professional efficiency, checking vitals and examining injuries with practiced movements, but I could see the answer on her face before she spoke. Chen was alive, but barely, with multiple broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, definitely a concussion, and possibly worse. His breathing was labored and wet-sounding, suggesting lung damage, and he needed a hospital immediately, needed surgery and monitoring and care we couldn't provide in the middle of the forest. Without treatment, Morrison gave him maybe 24 hours, and with treatment, his chances were good. But we were 8 miles from help, with something hunting us that had just proven our weapons were barely adequate to drive it off. Mitchell made the decision quickly, the kind of command decision that separates leaders from followers. We would carry Chen out, moving as fast as possible while maintaining tactical awareness. No more stops except what was absolutely necessary. No more caution about noise or stealth. Speed was everything now. Speed and distance and reaching the vehicles before that thing decided to come back. We rigged a stretcher from branches and spare jackets, working efficiently despite the fear that sat in all our chests like ice, and Chen regained consciousness briefly, long enough to moan in pain before slipping back under. The next 2 hours were a nightmare of exhaustion and terror that I still dream about decades later. 4 of us carried the stretcher while 8 maintained security, rotating every 15 minutes when the carriers were exhausted, because Chen was a big man, well over 200 pounds, and carrying him through rough terrain while watching for threats and maintaining speed was brutal work. My shoulders burned and my hands cramped on the stretcher poles, sweat soaking through my clothes despite the cold. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the psychological pressure. We saw nothing and heard nothing, but the sense of being watched never faded for a moment. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision only to find nothing. When I looked directly, shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking at them, and the forest felt alive with malevolence, as if the trees themselves wanted us gone or dead. Rachel, who was walking security next to me during one rotation, leaned close and whispered that she had found blood on the trail behind us. Not human blood, but dark, almost black, with a smell like copper and rotting meat. The creature was wounded, we knew that. We had seen the impacts and watched it stagger from the force of our fire, but it was following us anyway, tracking us despite its injuries, driven by something beyond animal instinct. Wounded predators were supposed to retreat, to hide and heal and avoid further conflict. But this one was hunting despite the wounds it had taken, and that terrified me more than anything else we had experienced. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of red and orange that seemed obscene after what we had been through, we reached a small clearing with an abandoned hunting blind on the far side. Mitchell called a halt and announced we would make our stand here, fortify the position, and hold until first light. We were still 3 miles from the staging area, and it would be full dark within the hour, and Chen needed rest, even if that rest came with terrible risk. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across, with the hunting blind in the northeast corner elevated about 12 feet on a wooden platform. The blind was old but structurally sound, and Mitchell and Torres quickly assessed the tactical situation with the kind of rapid planning that comes from years of field experience. The elevated position would give us visibility and make it harder for anything to reach us, and the clearing would force any attack to cross open ground, where we would have clear fields of fire. We moved Chen up into the blind as carefully as we could, then established defensive positions around the clearing's perimeter while Mitchell set up a watch rotation. 3 people in the blind with Chen, 3 positioned around the clearing on the ground, and everyone else would try to rest in shifts, maintaining the rotation through the night and staying alert and ready for whatever came. I took the first ground watch with Rachel and Trooper Santos, positioning ourselves roughly 20 feet apart at the clearing's edge to create overlapping fields of fire that covered all approaches. The temperature was dropping fast, our breath misting in the air, and above us in the blind, I could hear Torres radioing for help on their emergency frequency. The mountains and dense forest made communication difficult, but he managed to get a partial message through to State Police Dispatch before the signal degraded completely, telling them we had 1 critically injured, were under sustained threat from unknown hostile, and requesting immediate extraction. Full dark came at 7:30, and the temperature continued to drop. We had flashlights and weapon-mounted lights, but Mitchell ordered us to use them sparingly. Light discipline would help preserve our night vision and make it harder for anything out there to target us. The moon was a thin crescent, providing almost no illumination, and the forest around us became a wall of absolute blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. At 8:15, we heard movement in the trees to the east, something large circling the clearing and staying just beyond the tree line, moving with deliberate slowness that suggested reconnaissance rather than random animal behavior. We could hear branches snapping and the rustle of undergrowth being pushed aside and the occasional scrape of claws on bark, and the sounds moved slowly around the clearing's perimeter from north to west to south, taking perhaps 20 minutes to complete the circuit. It was learning our position, looking for weaknesses, studying us the way a predator studies prey before deciding how to attack, and that realization made my legs ache from standing motionless in the cold and my fingers go numb despite my gloves. Then the sound stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before and more oppressive. I checked my watch obsessively, counting minutes and trying to predict when the next approach would come, while my breath came out in clouds and my heart hammered against my ribs. In the blind above me, I could hear Chen's labored breathing punctuated by occasional moans, and the sound carried too far in the stillness, advertising our position to anything that might be listening. At 9:40, Agent Webb, who had the best vantage point from the blind, whispered down to us that there was movement at the tree line directly south, about 40 yards out. He described something standing there watching us, tall enough that he could see its silhouette against the slightly lighter sky beyond the trees, and he gave us details in careful clinical language that made my skin crawl. Bipedal stance, broad shoulders, head too large and wrong-shaped for any known animal, absolute stillness like a statue with not even the rise and fall of breathing that he could detect. Mitchell's order to hold fire was whispered but firm, We needed to conserve ammunition and keep our positions concealed as long as possible, and the creature watched us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 5 minutes before it melted back into the darkness without a sound. Over the next 3 hours, it approached 4 more times, each approach from a different direction, testing different parts of our perimeter, but never coming quite close enough to justify firing. It was smart and tactical, understanding that we had limited ammunition and that every shot we fired would deplete our resources and reveal our positions. It was wearing us down psychologically, making us jump at shadows and exhausting us with constant vigilance, and I understood with terrible clarity that we were dealing with something that thought and planned and made decisions based on observation and analysis. Around 11, Torres managed to get another message through to dispatch, the transmission broken and full of static, but conveying the essentials. One critically injured, under sustained threat from unknown hostile, requesting immediate extraction at first light. The response was garbled but seemed to indicate helicopters would come at dawn if weather permitted, which meant we had to survive 7 more hours, 7 hours of darkness and cold, and being stalked by something that showed no signs of losing interest or giving up. Agent Cole, who was in the blind trying to keep Chen stable, reported that his condition was deteriorating. His breathing had become more labored, his skin was cold and clammy, and his pulse was weak and thready. She didn't say he was dying because she didn't need to. We all knew that every hour we were stuck here reduced his chances of survival, but there was nothing we could do except hold our position and pray that dawn came before the creature decided to press its attack. At midnight, I rotated into the blind for my watch shift, climbing up the wooden ladder with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion, and the elevated position gave me a comprehensive view of the clearing and the surrounding tree line, while also making me feel exposed and vulnerable. Chen was unconscious but still breathing, and Cole sat beside him monitoring his vitals with what limited equipment we had and trying to keep him warm with our spare jackets. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale in the dim light from my shielded flashlight, and she told me his pupils were unequal, suggesting increased intracranial pressure, probably bleeding in his brain, and without surgery soon he wouldn't make it. The rest of the night was the longest of my life, hours that stretched like days while the temperature dropped and the creature continued its psychological assault. It circled our position repeatedly, sometimes coming close enough that we could hear its breathing, deep and labored like it was wounded, but still determined. Every hour it would test our defenses, rushing the clearing from different directions and forcing us to fire and waste ammunition, and by 3 a.m. we had gone through 60% of our supply. Mitchell called up to the blind asking for ammunition count, and I checked with the others, then delivered the bad news. At this rate we would be out before dawn, and he made the call that I had been dreading. Controlled fire only from this point forward, no sustained bursts, no panic shooting, aimed shots only when we had clear targets because every round had to count. The next 2 hours were psychological torture as the creature circled us constantly, making enough noise to keep us alert but never presenting a clear target, never coming quite close enough to justify shooting. It was wearing us down and it knew it, and occasionally we would catch glimpses between trees or see the brief silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, but never long enough or solid enough to guarantee a hit. At 4:30, as the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky, the creature made its final attempt. No warning, no preliminary circling, it came from the west at full speed, crossing the clearing in massive bounds that covered ground impossibly fast. We opened fire, every weapon from the blind and the ground positions, and I saw hits, saw the creature stagger as rounds impacted, but it kept coming with determination that exceeded anything in normal animal behavior. It reached the base of the blind and began to climb, those powerful claws gripping the wooden supports and pulling itself up with terrifying strength, and I was directly above it, firing straight down as it climbed. I saw my rounds impact its skull, saw bone and flesh tear, but it kept coming, its claws gripping the platform edge as those jaws opened to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was dead. Agent Keller saved us all with a flare gun he had been carrying as part of his emergency kit, standard equipment for wilderness operations, though rarely needed. In the chaos of the attack, with the creature's head rising above the platform's edge and those intelligent, hate-filled eyes meeting mine, Keller acted on instinct rather than thought. He shoved the flare gun's muzzle directly into the creature's face, perhaps 6 inches from those eyes, and fired. The magnesium flare ignited at point-blank range, burning at 3,000 degrees, and the effect was immediate and horrifying. The creature's scream was unlike anything I had ever heard, something between animal agony and almost human suffering, and the sound cut through the night and echoed from the hills around us. It fell backward off the ladder, clawing at its face where the flare had embedded itself in the orbital socket of its left eye, and hit the ground hard, thrashing in the dirt while the flare still burned with brilliant white light. For the first time, we could see it clearly, 7.5 feet tall and heavily muscled, covered in dark brown fur that was almost black, with a canine head that was larger than any wolf and more intelligent. The burning flare had destroyed the left side of its face, the flesh blackened and peeling, and despite the wound, despite the pain that must have been excruciating, the creature didn't die. It gathered itself, still clawing at its face, and began dragging itself toward the tree line, the movement slower now and pained but still purposeful, still driven by will rather than instinct. We watched it go and nobody fired, nobody moved, just watched this impossible thing crawl into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood that looked black in the harsh illumination. The flare burned for almost 10 minutes, a white-hot magnesium fire that couldn't be extinguished, and we tracked the creature's movement by that light as it dragged itself deeper into the forest. Eventually, it disappeared behind dense undergrowth, and the light faded as distance and vegetation intervened, and then finally, blessed silence fell over the clearing. Chen died at 5:15, just as the eastern sky was beginning to brighten from black to gray, and Cole had been monitoring his pulse when it stopped. She performed CPR desperately, compressions and breaths while tears streamed down her face, but he was gone. Too much internal damage and too much time without proper care. The state police helicopter arrived at 7:30, and the sound of its rotors was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. They landed in the clearing, and medical personnel jumped out before the skids touched ground, and they loaded Chen's body first, and then the rest of us, flying us out in 2 lifts, because the bird couldn't carry everyone at once. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Chen had died from injuries sustained during a bear attack while conducting training operations. The bear had been engaged by the training group and subsequently escaped, and the massive ammunition expenditure was justified as necessary force against a dangerous predator. There was no mention of bipedal movement, of intelligence, of coordinated stalking behavior, no mention of wounds that should have been lethal but weren't. Just a bear attack, tragic but routine, the kind of thing that happens occasionally when humans venture into wilderness areas. I signed the non-disclosure agreements because I had no choice, because my career and pension and possibly my freedom depended on my silence, and because the people who debriefed me made it very clear that the truth would never see the light of day. But I'm dying now, and those threats mean nothing compared to the knowledge I've carried for 23 years. Something exists in those Michigan forests that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of the natural world, something intelligent and dangerous and very much real. I've spent 2 decades trying to forget what I saw, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. But the truth is, I know what hunted us that night, did us. I know why Chen died, and why the Bureau worked so hard to bury the evidence, and I know that somewhere in those woods, something still walks upright in the darkness. My name is David Brennan. I served my country for 22 years, and this is what happened in March of 2001 in the Manistee National Forest. This is the truth they tried to bury, and this is why you should think twice before venturing into those deep forests where the maps run out and the cell coverage fails. Some things exist whether we believe in them or not.